So if you guys could go back in time and think to your childhood, like a cartoon or animated series that you watched or really liked, and if you could pick one of them that you could join or be a part of, which one would it be?
Ninja Turtles or Ghostbusters. I loved those cartoons as a kid.
Ghostbusters was a cartoon?
Yeah, I don't remember that either.
Yeah.
It must have been an 80s thing.
It was.
Okay.
And it was phenomenal.
Okay.
I watched it every
Were you
Saturday
born
morning.
in the 80s?
No, I was born in 91.
Yeah. Every Saturday morning, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Ghostbusters were on.
Okay.
I too was not born in the 80s.
Oh, yeah?
79. G.I. Joe. That was one. I loved everything about it.
Nice.
And another thing about it, they were always at war and no one ever got shot and killed. Did you ever notice, like, they always, like, if they were in a plane and they would shoot a missile and hit it, they would always parachute down.
Somehow got out unscathed over and over again.
And it wasn't the line in G.I. Joe's was like, and that's knowing, and knowing is half the battle.
Yeah. You guys remember Captain Planet?
Oh, yes. Captain Planet.
It was terrible.
I had toys. I had toys from Captain Planet, and during COVID, I don't know if I told you guys this, but I had this weird binge where a lot of my toys my mom gave away when I was young. So I went into this weird nostalgic spiral and like started looking up old toys on eBay, and one of them was Captain Planet toy. But one of my favorite shows was probably Batman. It was literally called the Batman the Animated Series in the 90s. It was incredible. Show. But I'm gonna go actually Hey Arnold. Hey Arnold was probably one of my all-time favorite cartoons. And I loved it was definitely a 90s kid thing. It's like very much touted as a 90s kid thing. But loved Hey Arnold. There was a lot of like cool life lessons, but basically they just were always doing stuff all around the city. It was like an amalgamation of, I don't know if it's supposed to be like New York City with other cities combined. They always played this like cool jazz music in it. And I love it still to this day. It's one of the few cartoons as an adult I can still watch. Like, you know how you guys go back and you watch it and you're like, this is not what I remember it. Hey Arnold is still.
Was that the football-headed kid?
Yeah, the football head. Yeah.
Did you guys ever watch He-Man?
Oh, I loved He-Man.
I remember He-Man for us, like our family were like fairly conservative Christians, and that was like riding the line. Like I remember like some people were like, you can't watch He-Man because it's like the power of Grayskull and different things. And they're like, is this like demonic? Is this sorcery?
Magic powers and sorcery in it.
I don't remember if I was 5 or 6, but I dressed up like He-Man, and my mom made me a He-Man costume and had pantyhose and stuffed like cotton into them, so I had the muscles and everything. It was great.
Well, I bet it was super creepy.
It was.
Like, doesn't look
as a kid, you're like, this is awesome.
Yeah, exactly. You feel a lot cooler than it actually probably looked. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us here at the Branch Podcast. I'm Anthony, one of the pastors here at the Tree.Church, joined by Matthew, our lead pastor, and Chris, also a pastor on staff and director of biblical studies. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of gossip and slander. Guys, the reason I wanted to talk about this is I think it's one of the more pervasive sins that a lot of us struggle with, honestly. And I think the reason why we struggle with it is because many times it flies under the radar, right? It's not as obvious as maybe some of the other things that we can easily point out in our lives. And yet, as I hope we'll get into, it can be profoundly destructive to people and relationships and people's reputations and lots of other things. So I wanted to start off with just a general question. How would we define gossip and slander so everyone knows what we're talking about? And where is there overlap between those two things? Because what we will see and we'll talk about, we do notice a distinction in Scripture, but what are the comparisons and contrast of those two words? How are they different, and how would we define them?
I was going to say, I would define slander as purposefully defaming someone's name. So like saying something bad about a person that you know is not true, that you're just doing it just to tear them down, to spread false truths, lies, rumors about them. Where gossip might have something true about it, you're just sharing it to make yourself feel better. You're sharing it to tear them down. But it can have it can be true and still be gossip. So that's where I would delineate between the two of them in my mind. Like, so slander is this like purposeful, like demeaning and defaming someone's name, like making other people think badly about the other person.
Sure.
And then gossip is just like sharing information that you have no authority in, and will bring no good for the purpose of either making yourself feel better or making somebody else feel bad.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that definition. Slander is always bad. Gossip doesn't always have the same mean-spirited bent to it, because it can just be passing on information.
Yeah.
It's not always destructive, I guess, in the sense, unless I'm just misunderstanding that a tad bit. But I mean, like, sometimes you just pass on, like, oh, did you hear so-and-so bought a car? You know, you're not trying to, shame them and stuff. It's like the gossip. Oh, I heard that they're moving, heard they're getting a new house, Whereas slander is always, it's meant, it is always a lie. Even in our culture, legally, it's a legal thing, slander. And so it is vocalized. It's meant to defame someone. It's meant to hurt them. Gossip, more often than not, has the same bent to it. So I think they do overlap quite a bit. But slander is always false. Gossip can be true or false.
I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So I think one of the things that happens with slander is there are people who say slanderous things that are convinced that they're true. And so there's almost like the distortion of perception. This situation happened, this person did this or acted this way, when in reality, they're maligning their character and taking something and actually distorting it. And so I think that's one of the things that often happens. But with gossip, one of my questions to you guys with that is, where do you draw the line? Because you brought up a great point. And I think this is something, just to be fully transparent and honest, there have been times where I've actually asked myself in the course of a conversation, is this gossip? Am I gossiping right now? And so I think for many people, those lines oftentimes are a little bit blurry, because at what point do you say, well, you can't ever talk about anyone or anything or any situation ever because it's gossip? And so from a biblical standpoint, is it all the same? Is it all wrong? Is it all sinful? How do we kind of delineate those things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the language that's used, whether it be in the Old Testament or New Testament, as we translate it into the terms gossip and or slander. But in all of the context that it's mentioned in Scripture, it's always used for the idea of passing on information for the purpose of destroying someone's reputation. So I think we need to be clear about that. Is like, the Bible's not condemning you talking about someone in a casual and or redemptive way. Sure. Because we do that as friends and we do that as family.
Right.
If we went over your house on Saturday, if I'm telling Chris about it, going, oh man, they got a beautiful pool, I love their house, it was such a fun time, that's not for the purpose of hurting you.
Right.
And so the Bible's talking about the things we pass on that can hurt someone. And I want to be clear, even something you just kind of said, you're mentioning it, I think one of the things that is oftentimes confusing to people, if that's the right term, is they think because it's true, that somehow makes it permissible to share. And the truth, or because like you said, like sometimes they actually believe the slander. Well, that doesn't change anything.
Sure.
Just because something's true or false does not change if it's morally right to share it. You have to ask, what's the consequence of what you're sharing? But yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
I was going to say too, like, I think you have to be reflective of your heart and your intention for the information. Like you said, if you're just sharing information because you're excited or you want to celebrate something, like it's one thing. If you see in your heart and you're looking at like the situation, you're like, I want to share this information because it's going to shape how this person will feel about so-and-so, then like in a negative way.
Sure.
Like if you're honest with yourself enough to say, that's why I'm doing that, then that's gossip. You know what I mean? Like in a negative way. If you're doing it to make yourself look better in a context where another person could be comparing two people, I would say that's gossip in a negative way. You know what I mean? So like for me, it's really about like, what am I getting out of this? And what is the purpose of my sharing this information? And if I can be honest with myself about it, like a lot of times it will stem between, oh, I need to stop talking now, or like, oh, this is okay. Like this is just us talking about information, if that makes sense. Yeah, no,
I think thinking about your motive is an important piece, right? Like what is really the motive behind it? And sometimes it's not malicious. Sometimes it's just like the entertainment value, right? Of like just talking about people. I think we've all maybe encountered those people in our lives that they seem to, much of their time and emphasis when you're with them is like always talking about, like it's where the expression like, did you guys hear the gossip? That kind of mindset or personality, always talking about the things that other people are doing or the news that they heard. And I would say, there's not necessarily necessarily, it doesn't always mean that's negative, but it's also a slippery slope, right?
Yeah,
it can be something that you need to be mindful of, need to be careful. But I think the motive is a really big one. For me personally, I've been in situations where I also try to be very charitable. So if I'm talking about a situation, because I'm mindful of how slippery that slope really is, I want to be fair if I'm talking about a situation, and I also want to be as favorable as I can be when talking about that person, because I'm very sensitive to, if I say something a certain way, the way another person hears that or perceives that or now even thinks about that person can be very much dependent on how I articulate something or how I express something, which kind of leads me to another question. It's a two-part question. How do we often see this show up? And I know we're kind of getting into that. How does this often show up? I do think sometimes it's subtle, but then secondly, what are the ramifications or the implications of this, the consequences of not guarding our mouths, not guarding our hearts, not being careful and intentional in the conversations we're having with people about other people?
I think ways it shows up, like I can think of in my own life, there have been times when people have frustrated me, and then I have had that conversation with my wife, not for the purpose of like not from getting like a perspective, but for the purpose of just like, I need to vent this. You know what I mean? Like that person frustrated me, they're acting like a jerk, whatever. Like, and so like, those are moments where I go like, oh, this was super unhealthy. This was me passing along gossip. This was not me trying to get a good perspective on something. This was just me being angry and wanting to do something about it. The destructive part of that is I've seen how that shapes her thought process at times of that person. And so like when you do those things, and the trickiness of that is like, how do we express frustration? How do we get varying perspectives? How do we do those things in a healthy way? But what I've seen is like it begins to tend to shape like her perspective in certain ways. And so now not only have I been frustrated, but now she's frustrated. And then you add to it the fact that maybe I get over it, but she's still frustrated. So now like there's just this frustration that's been perpetuated for little to no reason other than it felt really good to get it off my chest in the moment. You know what I'm saying? So
for sure.
Like, I think that is some of the ways in which it just becomes damaging really quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, for me, how gossip shows up more often than not, if I'm going to participate in gossip, it's usually because someone's hurt me, honestly. There's a part of it that they've hurt me in the sense of maybe they have said something about me that feels unfair. They treated me in a way that feels unfair. And there's a part of me that wants to defend myself by, it's like, well, let me tell you about them. You know, it's like almost that attitude. And that's where I have to battle. I have to fight back because I am thankful for this. I think I have broken the part of me that maybe was there when I was younger of like, ooh, this is fun to give someone a morsel of gossip. Like, I think I've broken that. I don't feel like I have a bent in my personality where just in my normal conversations, I want to tear people down. I don't find enjoying that. It feels gross to me. Yeah. It really is in a self-defensive way where I'm like, oh, okay, that person hurt me. They ruined my reputation. I want people to know who they really are. That's when I find myself battling it. And I have to check myself. Like even what you said, where I'll be in the middle of talking to, whether it's my wife or maybe another person on staff, and I have to like pause and be like, is this gossip? And there are times it is, right? Like where you have to check yourself and go like, you know what, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have even said that. The fallout from it is I think gossip is damaging to everyone involved. I think the person who gossips, it is very destructive to them. I think it so creates a rhythm of communication that allows a desensitizing to the damaging effects of communication. So like if you're gossiping about a person, then you are feeding into the division. There's no way, like I've said this before, it is impossible to hate someone that you're genuinely praying for. Right. So when Scripture says pray for your enemies, you know, try that sometime. And if you are consistently, genuinely praying for your enemies, you will find it impossible to hate them. You'll find it impossible to gossip for them while praying for them. But if you aren't praying for them and you're gossiping, you can promise yourself you're going to hate them more. So it is destructive to your own heart. The second part about it is, I mean, even as James says, like a forest can be set on fire by your words. And it is that powerful imagery that just like the spark that comes out of your mouth, and you'll never be able to put it out. You'll never know where that gossip ended, if it did end.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, like I'll be personal for a moment. I've had this happen in my life in the last year or two, where I've had, in my own mind, I'll keep it vague because it doesn't matter. I'm not going to gossip, right? I'll keep it vague. But in the situation where I had one situation I didn't handle well. I did not. I'll be the first to admit, I did admit it. I did not handle a situation well. And I had a person talk about it and gossip about it, and it got back to me through the long way, where where you know where it finally gets to, you're like, wow, you're 7 people removed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so here was the problem. The original person where I didn't handle it well, I reconciled with them fully. But all those other people, now that's their perspective of me with no mercy. And the reason why I say that, then I had a second situation where I wasn't in the wrong. I was totally in the right. But the person got angry at me, gossiped basically to that same group. And this is the sad part about it. I've reconciled with that person too. The sad part about it is that group in the middle, they still view me through both of those things. One was unfair and one was fair, but they view me through both of it. Their reality of me now is completely negative. So on my own side, the personal side of me, I'm like, that's a bummer, right? But it also hurts their hearts. And so like I can move on because I wasn't close with them. Like I can move on, but it's just, I feel sad that now it's impacted my influence in their life. And I think, why? Because of gossip. And I've had the same thing in my own life where I've thought, I have said things about people, like to Mary, to my wife, and I later on reconcile and or just get over it. And I realize way after the fact, she's still there. You know what I mean? Like if I tell Mary, and I think you guys can attest to this, if I tell Mary that someone hurt me, she's going to be more defensive of me than I will be of me. Right.
Yeah.
So now like I get over it and Mary's like, oh, that person did that. You know, like, and I get it because
like
I do the same way.
on her hit list.
Right. Because I do the same way. Like if you came after me, like I could probably give you grace. You come after Mary, it's hard for me. It's hard for me if you come after my wife or kids. And so like, it's that perspective of like, oh, I mean, like there have been times I'm holding grudges against 6th graders. Because it hurt my kids. You know what I mean? Where you're like years later, that kid is like graduated high school and you're like, I remember in 6th grade when you said that to my son.
I know who you really are.
Yeah, exactly. And so like there's that part of you that you have to fight against. And so I'm even careful what I communicate to Mary. I really am, because I realize, you know what? I'll be able to get over this. I'll probably reconcile. I'll be able to get over this. And I just don't want to put that in her heart because I think that's so hard for her.
Yeah, you're talking about like 3 dynamics. Part of it, is you're almost reinforcing your own negative emotions and feelings, which as Christians, we shouldn't want to do that, right? Like it's part of the reason why the Psalms give us this picture of like bringing our burdens before God, right? Like you have David just basically railing against his enemies before the Lord. And that is one of the things that we should be doing. But guarding our own hearts. But then you just brought up the point of like the person that you're telling, you're now burdening them with that information, whether they want it or not. And so you're actually distorting their view of a person, whether it's fair or not, right? Whether you're being honest or not. But there's that other element of like, that might be a one-off situation. That's not the totality of who that person is. And oftentimes what I've realized in gossip, especially in like a workplace environment, a person can be offended or hurt, and the person who offended or hurt them may not even be fully aware of it. And so then that person goes, talks about them to another coworker. That person's not aware of it. And so it's totally unfair to them because you didn't address it. You didn't even give them the chance to apologize or acknowledge it or acknowledge their wrongdoing. Right. And now you're painting a picture to all the people you're talking to. And so it's negatively impacting you. You're reinforcing your own negative emotions towards that person. You're infecting everybody else with these negative feelings, and you're essentially destroying that one person's reputation. And so it really is almost has a cancerous effect when 100%. A wildfire, as Scripture says, you said, James chapter 3, like it catches the entire forest on fire, and none of it is redemptive ultimately. Like it's not. It doesn't bring about any positive or redemptive results.
Well, I was just going to say it disintegrates trust, and trust is vital for relationship. If you are the person who gossips, like you now are, like you are someone who is not safe to tell things to, because you're now the person who is going to go tell it to whoever and talk about it more. So you're not safe. If you find out somebody's gossiped about you, well, what does that do to the trust in that relationship? You know what I mean?
You don't want to be around them anymore.
Yeah, right. You don't want to entrust you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You don't want to trust yourself to them because they go behind your back and talk about you. And so like, it really does just disintegrate the nature of our relationships with each other. So you have to be super careful with how you share that information or if you share that information.
Yeah. So what are some scriptural insights we can have? So this is obviously a part of a larger conversation about our words. So you kind of already referenced some of what James says, and his is one of the most explicit, I would say, in actually all of Scripture, James chapter 3, where he kind of gives this massive discourse on our words. But what are some of the scriptural teachings about gossip, slander, not only on the negative side, but then on the positive side, how we actually need to be mindful of our words and how we're supposed to be communicating as Christians?
I mean, yeah, you have it all throughout the Bible. So you have powerful statements like life and death is found in the mouth or in the tongue or the words that you speak. And I think we've all been recipients of that. I mean, we've had those moments. I had a meeting today where I was sharing with one of the employees. I said, I was talking with Brandon. So Brandon's our executive pastor. I said, I was talking to Brandon about you, and he just told me he just had the best meeting with you this week. And you just saw her demeanor change, right? It's like words of life. Like we all love it. We've all been a part of like, oh, that's great to hear when someone like, this is funny, I'll share this. I don't really struggle too much insecurity from aging. It's just a reality of it. I joke about it and stuff, but I'm really uncomfortable. But one of the dynamics is like, I have more gray in my beard. That's probably the most place that you'll see it. And there was a part of me that I was like, I was growing my beard out and I was like, you know what? Does that look stupid? I just got like 2 gray streaks right in my beard. And I remember Michael Giacomoni was like, your beard with that gray looks so cool. And it was funny how an insecurity in a second became a confidence.
Yeah.
Where I was like,
so good.
Oh, it does? I was like, oh, wow. Okay, so we've been the recipients of that where someone just, you know, you guys are both communicators. You get off the stage and you're feeling a tad bit insecure. And someone goes, thank you for that. That was life-changing to me. And you're like, oh, okay, right, okay. Then we've all been the flip side of that, where someone just says a remark, a flippant remark, or, you know, a cutting remark, mean-spirited, and you're like, you're devastated by it. So Scripture is talking about that. I mean, like you have that power inside of you to give someone life or to kill them.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key that we need to understand is like, that comes with stewardship then. Like you have to steward the what God has given you. So there are all these scriptures that will talk about it. And like, I think more specifically in the New Testament, there's a lot of list at different places in the New Testament about destructive and evil behavior. And almost to the list, it has some element of slander, gossip, division, dissension, some form of like you're using words to create tension in relationships and how that's condemned. And so like, I think we need to understand how much God hates that. God hates division. God hates those who cause division. So like when you go to the Proverbs and read through it, it is just saturated with basically the fool or the one who divides and how God despises that. So I think we need to understand the power that our words are not a small thing to God.
Yeah.
And I think too, like the idea that you kind of already mentioned, the idea of what we feed thrives. You see that in Philippians where he talks about focus on good things. He's like, put your mind on things from above. I might be mixing Colossians with Philippians, but you get the idea. Yeah. But the idea is like the wolf we feed thrives. So if we feed that negativity, that's going to be the environment that we have around us all the time. It's going to be the world we live in.
It's good.
If we feed encouragement, if we think positive, and it's not just positive thinking. I don't think it's like glossing over like negative things you need to deal with. But if we keep our mindset on thinking even about negative things in the way that Christ calls us to think about them, to be praying about them, to be thinking good of other people, even good of our enemies, like you already mentioned, I think that just fosters a nature in us that is focused on the positive of it, not allowing those negative things to take us over and be the world that we live in. Yeah,
absolutely. I was thinking about, Matthew, when you were talking about just, you know, how our words are no small thing. And then I was thinking about even from a more of a theologically profound way of thinking about it, that God, right, he creates through his words, right, through his speech. And then you think about like this idea of, okay, God has given speech to us, and communication is paramount when it comes to relationships, right? Like one of the things as pastors, we've all done like premarital counseling stuff. I'm sure all of us have talked about the dynamics of communication in marriage, right? The idea that a healthy relationship, it cannot flourish without good communication. Well, God has designed it for whatever reason. Maybe it's just because it's the way he himself operates. He communicates, things happen. So then it makes sense on the flip side why negative communication would have such profound negative impacts. That the words that we use, oftentimes we tend to be dismissive of them, right? Because our actions matter more. But when you think about the way that God is, that God actually reveals himself, God reveals his love, not just in word, also in deed, but God reveals so much of himself to us, and God created the world through his words. And now we are ultimately, per our last conversation on the last podcast, this idea of being image bearers of God, the way that we relate to one another, the way that we relate to the world, our words are a part of that, right? And so it's not just, well, I can, as long as I act appropriately, my words don't really matter. No, our words are very much, they do very much matter to God, because it's a part of the way that we've been designed even to reflect the way that he interacts with the world.
Yeah, I mean, so in James, it says that so James chapter 3 really is probably the most comprehensive, thorough teaching of the power of our language and our tongues. But in it says, out of the same mouth we praise God and curse our brothers. And he's like, these things ought not to be.
Yeah.
And it is true. As Christians, there is a higher calling that we have. We can't have the hypocrisy of coming to church and praising God and then destroying his creation, destroying his children verbally. And James even goes as far as to say, no one can tame their tongue. It says that, but what it's implying is on your own, you can't do it. You need God's help for this. And so there is, I think all of us have to acknowledge, we all will struggle with this. This is a universal sin. I don't think we all equally struggle with every sin the exact same.
Right.
But this is one that I think unites us all.
Sure.
Is the power of our speech. And that's what James is saying. And so I think we have to recognize that it is a tension, and it's a tension that we have to address, so that we need to have a hypersensitivity to it. Otherwise, it goes unchecked and it hurts us the way that we've already described.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking James chapter 1 as well. He makes this statement that is very sobering. When I read it, I'm like, oh man, that hits me. It hits me hard. It's James 1:26. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. I mean, you think about the weight of that statement. He's basically saying, if you think you're a religious person, if you think you're a spiritual person, to use today's jargon, right? If you think you're a good Christian, but you are not watchful in your words, if you're not careful in how you're speaking to and about other people, you've deceived yourself. Your religion is worthless. Those are sobering words that should make us take inventory of our own lives.
So even as we've just described James, think about this. He writes this document, and in the beginning, he's talking about your tongue, your language. Yeah. He moves on to favoritism, and moves on to faith and deeds. And then in chapter 3, he comes back here, let's go back to the way
I need to reiterate this again. This is important.
Yeah, and I mean, the imagery that he uses of on a rudder of a ship is so small, but it steers the whole ship. The whole ship. He's like, your tongue does the same thing. The same way that a little bit in a horse's mouth can direct this huge animal. He goes, that's what your tongue does. It determines the direction of your life and the quality of your life. And again, I agree. That's a sobering reality that it's going to determine if you have real faith or not. It's going to determine the direction of your life. And I think so often people get so caught up in drama. Drama is fun. There's a part of it, we know this in social media. There are things that the moment you do it, you get what they call a dopamine hit where you're like, oh, that feels good. Gossip's that way. Yeah. There's that moment where you're like, oh yeah, this is exciting. You're giving me a nugget of information. But man, that's that every single time. It's just another layer of a cancerous, sinful destruction that's happening in your heart and in that relationship.
Yeah. So 2 questions. I think these, we want to get practical for people, right? So my first question would be, what do we do when you find yourself, what do you do as a person when you find yourself in a group situation where somebody else is gossiping? So you're not the one gossiping. You're not the one talking about another person. This is a tension that I've experienced. I'm sure you guys have as well, as all people probably to some degree. As Christians, do we have an obligation in that? I mean, I think one of the tensions, right, is we don't want to be complicit in sinful behavior, regardless of the situation. But I do think this is one of those difficult ones, because for some reason to us, oftentimes it doesn't feel as weighty. It doesn't feel as significant. So what would you guys say to a person who's in a social gathering, right? They're hanging out with friends. regardless if they're Christians or not, what do you do in a situation where you find someone who maybe is slandering, talking negatively about another person, or just generally gossiping about another person and kind of giving a negative viewpoint of that person's life? How should we react in a situation like that?
Well, I have a simple answer, then I have an analogy because I'm a pastor. That's how I think, okay? The simple answer is you have to put a stop to it. And it is one part, stop, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to listen to it, but I think it goes beyond that. I think a biblical perspective, if you're talking with another Christian and you have the same biblical foundation, is you need to confront them and say, you need to go talk to that person. You need to resolve this issue. And the reason why, and I know how uncomfortable that feels, but just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean we don't have to do it.
Sure.
So these are some weird analogies, but I'll give them and it'll make sense in a second. If you don't do drugs, right, and someone in front of you in a room, a small room, just lights up a joint and starts smoking, what would you do? You'd be like, whoa, stop. Like, I don't do drugs. Don't smoke in front of me. If someone in front of you like just pulls out something that's toxic, some type of chemical, and just starts spraying it in the air, you'd be like, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. Stop. No, you'd get out of there, right? Mm-hmm. That's how you have to view gossip. It is destructive to your heart. It's planting divisive seeds. So if you know that person, you now are going to have that divisiveness against them. If you don't, it's still the practice of gossip is corrupting your heart. Mm-hmm. And again, people won't view it this way to this extreme more often than not, but that's the level you have to view it of like, wait a second, this is damaging to the relationship, it's damaging to my heart, it's damaging to my relationship with God. I don't want to be a part of it. So like the same urgency you would have to stop someone from smoking a joint or spraying chemicals in the air, you'd be like, stop. You have to have that same urgency. You can do it in a respectful way, but you should be direct. And I mean, I have done this at times in my life, and it's awkward.
Yeah,
For sure. To go, hey, and this is how I do it. I go, hey, real quick, does this have anything to do with me? And they're like, no, not really. I'm going, you know what, then I don't want to know it just because it'll be hard for my heart and stuff. And it's awkward. The person usually gets embarrassed. Sometimes I get annoyed, but that's what you have to do. But I remember in high school, my brother-in-law, who's 2 years younger than me, that was his policy. He just would not listen to gossip, my brother-in-law, John. So we'd be like in the locker room, and you'd hear people be like, oh, did you guys hear about? And he'd be like, oh, hold on. He's like, does it have anything to do with me? They'd be like, no. And he's like, okay, I don't want to hear it. And I was like, man, as a sophomore telling seniors that, I was like super, I respected him. I had another guy that was a year older that was in Mary's class, Mike Susan, and he did the same thing. And I mean, those two guys were beautiful examples to me of like, that's what character looks like in high school. And that's never left me.
Yeah.
I've seen this in my daughter, my 12-year-old Abigail. They had been teaching about it for a while. Our children's ministry focuses on it very heavily. So like
it's a passion a pastor feels.
Yeah, they work on it a lot. Like they talk about gossip, how unhealthy it is. And I don't know how this came about, but she was talking about like how her and her friends, Nora, like how they had come up with a code word for when they recognized that each of them, like one of them in the group was gossiping. And so like they just created a code word, and every time
it was sinner. Can you imagine?
Oh man.
But every time that they thought that somebody in the group was gossiping, like they just would throw the code word out there, and the group of friends knew like, oh, this is the thing. So like
crossing a line.
Yeah. So like I think it was cucumber. I think is what they said. So leave it to 6-year-old.
I would say nothing like a discreet word like cucumber.
Yeah.
But so yeah, like just
I love that though.
Yeah, but it's just a creative way to go like, hey, like we want to hold each other accountable in this. We know it's a thing that we do. We know it's a thing that we don't want to do.
Yeah.
And so this is the strategy we have for making sure that we keep it out of our friend group.
Yeah, I remember just a very vivid example in my mind, and I was the hero in this case. I'm not saying that I always am, but it was one of those examples where this was actually early on in my Christian journey, and so it's not like I thought deeply about the concepts of gossip and slander at the time, but I mean, maybe it was like this for you guys. When I first became a Christian, man, like I just was so utterly zealous. Not that I'm not zealous now, but there was a certain simplicity and zealousness to my faith. And I remember I was with a gathering with some of the track team from Malone, and we were at a person's house sitting around a campfire, and there was a person that was at on the track team that wasn't there with us. And he wasn't always necessarily included in some of these gatherings, which even looking back now, very much like this exclusive mindset, which I don't love. But the girl that actually had us over to her house, it was her house that we were at, she started talking about him and basically just making fun of him, roasting him in front of all these people. And I got about 15 seconds into that, and I just basically was like, y'all need to stop like talking about him right now. Like, just basically confronted them. And it was, to your point, like it was so incredibly awkward because after that, it was basically just disrupted the entire conversation. But I literally could not contain it. It was one of those moments where like, I cannot sit here and just listen to her tear this dude apart, partly because he was a good guy. That was the other, but the other part of it, to me, there was something so sinister about just sitting there dismantling this dude's character and talking about him, making fun of him in front of all these other people. And especially because I even knew some of the other people there weren't cool with it. But I also knew that they probably weren't going to address it. So I just felt like a super heavy burden. This is something that I have to address. And looking back, I probably could have been a little bit more tactful. But I'm not ashamed of the fact that it was one of those things that needed to stop. Right? Conversation.
And I love that you had that sensitivity. Like I wish I did. I wish I always had that sensitivity where there is that urgency of no, stop. Like, because there are times that we are just too permissible to listen, to engage in things. And so I do hope that that sensitivity will continue to increase in my life toward gossip.
Yeah. So this is really the last question. And so the idea of gossip and slander, oftentimes, as you said earlier, it comes out of us being hurt, or maybe not even directly hurt or offended by a person, but maybe we're frustrated in dealing with this. Maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a family situation, whatever the context might be. But what are some of the biblical principles that we find in Scripture for how we should be handling this? Is there something that we should be doing that has a better effect? And obviously, the low-hanging fruit is yes. Of course, the Bible gives us a lot of guidelines on this. But I think it's important for people to know, what do we do in a situation like that? If you're frustrated, if someone's offended you, if someone has hurt you, what are the appropriate responses in those types of situations?
So one of the things that, I just talked with our staff about this. I said, gossip, they need to understand, gossip is never a step toward reconciliation. And I would even go further to say, gossip is always a step away from reconciliation. It's always a step in an unhealthy place. So what we see in Scripture is consistently a value that when someone offends you, go directly to them. So you have that mentioned in numerous places. You have in Matthew 18, and that's more so in the context of a Christian community, but it's, if someone has sinned against you, go to them directly, just the two of you. And if you can win them over, like if you can communicate and win them over, like you've won your brother or sister back, which is a beautiful thought, because you will reconcile better if you just go directly to the person and have a conversation versus going to someone, bashing them, putting gas on that fire of your heart against them. You're not going to reconcile. So go to them directly. It even would go further to say, if they don't hear you, get a couple of friends with you that are in that to go. It's all for the heart of reconciliation. There's another place that Jesus said, if you are at the altar, so the altar is a place where you'd be making sacrifices to reconcile your relationship with God, and there realize that your brother has something against you, leave your gift, go and reconcile, and then come back. So Jesus is literally saying, from God's perspective, he would prioritize your reconciliation before even God and your reconciliation. Like, this is how important it is to you. And so there is a call from God to go directly to the person. And I think this is what's lacking in our culture. Even in the church world, when people want to do things like, hey, I just want to give a prayer request. No, they want to gossip. You know what I mean? When they don't want to go. So if you don't want to go have a direct conversation, but you want to talk to someone else about it, you want to gossip. You want to slander. If you are going to, and this would be a follow-up question. So I'm going to answer your question, then I'm going to throw the question to you at follow-up. How can we talk about things to get godly counsel? I think that's a secondary question. But I think initially to check someone's heart is to say, if I'm not willing to go to this person, then I should shut my mouth. Yeah. If I'm not willing to go have a conversation, I should not talk, because I'm not willing to take a step toward reconciliation. If I'm willing to go have a conversation with them, then it looks differently. But that's what Jesus says. Go directly to the person.
I was going to say, the Psalms really model time reflecting and expressing frustration and anger to God. against other people. Like if you're frustrated with someone, you take it to God. God is a safe place to vent that frustration, that anger. God, I mean, some of the Psalms talk about, I won't even name them because it's just broken. Like I can point you to them if you want to go read them, but I'm not gonna talk about it right now. But like they say nasty things about people that have frustrated them because they're human. It's natural. When somebody hurts us, when somebody frustrates us, like
the amount of time that David asked God to break the teeth of his enemies, you're like,
such graphic image, right?
Yeah. And so like, but what it demonstrates is that God is a safe place to vent those things and to bring those things to. And so God gives us the venue for releasing that frustration in him. And then from there, that is also the safe place to get the wise counsel of to go and to be reconciled. And I think there are times, so my personality is I'm a stuffer. And so like I will naturally bypass things before addressing them. Not because I don't think they need to be addressed or not, but like I'll just be like, that's not a big deal and move on. And that's not a big deal and then move on. And then eventually they become a big deal because that's not a healthy way to handle it either. You know what I mean? So like stuffing, it's not healthy. So like overcoming that place to where when you spend time in God's presence, it allows you to come to the place where if you struggle to communicate the thing that you're frustrated about with somebody else, God gives you the courage to do it. God gives you the direction to do it and can help do that in a way that if I go to my wife or if I go to my friends or if I go, you know what I'm saying? Like if I go to somebody else, it's almost like if you took a piece of chocolate on a hot day and ran down the sidewalk with it, like it leaves like a chocolate streak the whole way down. Well, if we gossip and we vent, like we're leaving that streak all the way down where that doesn't happen with God, if that makes sense.
No, I love where both of you guys hit, I think, really two sides of what is so important for us as Christians. Because I think one of the tensions is when we as human beings, includes all of us, when we're hurt by someone, when we're offended by someone, when we're frustrated by someone, there is a human longing for validation and affirmation in that, right? And so I think one of the dangers is when we stay in that place, right? When we just, and I think a lot of times that's what gossip is rooted in, is we want to tell other people to be affirmed in our hurt feelings. We want to tell other people to be affirmed in our anger towards a situation so that they can go ahead and chime in and tell us how right we are. And so the underlying thing that I don't think is problematic in that we do want to be acknowledged. We want to be affirmed in where we've been hurt, where we've been wounded. But Chris, what you said answers a big part of that biblically. Like we're supposed to bring that to God. And oftentimes what God does, not only does he give us peace and bring healing, but he will even gently correct us and remind us of our call to give grace and actually take that person before us in prayer and transform them to where we start to view them a little bit differently. As you said earlier, like the idea of praying, it's really, really hard to hate someone or stay mad at someone when you're praying for them. And so it's this beautiful dynamic of I get to bring my frustration, I get to vent, if you will, to God, but also God does something redemptive with that. But the second piece is, as Christians, it's not just that we want to be affirmed when we're hurt. We want to feel like we're seen, but also we should, as Christians, desire restoration, desire redemption. We should desire to see something happen, resolution. And that can't happen when we're not willing to go to that person. And so I think we have to acknowledge that that is a difficult thing for a lot of people, especially depending on a person's personality. It can be incredibly difficult to go to a person and have a hard conversation, but it is one of the rhythms of God in Scripture where we see this is what you're called to do. You're called to be the person who is proactive enough. And again, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes you'll find that a person maybe didn't even know they hurt you or didn't realize it was as big of a deal as it was to you. And it gives them, it's charitable in that it gives them the opportunity to move towards you and as you move towards them. And then the ultimate hope for that would be reconciliation, and that God uses that to glorify himself and to set an example for other people. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind. But I love both of those things, and I think both of them really drive home the two sides of that. I think of even Romans 12, just this idea of do what is honorable in the sight of all. I think a lot of times we don't choose that route. We don't choose the route of what is honorable in the sight of it's what feels good, what validates me in my frustration, what validates me in my anger.
I agree with that. And I think if we're going to be real about it, if if we're unwilling to go to a person, then we should just know that any communication we have about it, no matter how we try to pretend it is, it's simply gossip. So what I mean by that is, well, I'm just going to get godly counsel. I'm just going to get a prayer request. I'm just going to say, if you're not willing to go and meet with that person, then that's not genuine. Yeah. And I think we have to check that. So like for me in my own heart, this is what I know. I've shared this in preaching numerous times. The warning of my heart, like the blinking red light, is when I have imaginary arguments with people. And like I honestly, to the point now where I'm getting really good at immediately stopping that even in my own head. So I realized I was not only having imaginary arguments, thinking it's okay, like I was actually like almost enjoying going to the imaginary argument. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like when you are destroying someone in your mind.
You always win too.
Always win, right? Yeah, I often said like, not only when I get done, the crowd is cheering for me. They're like, wonderful,
you're always
bravo,
right and you always win.
Yeah, the other person's like, you're so right. But I was almost finding enjoyment. But what I realized, it was locking my heart against that person. Like I am firmly establishing a defensive position. I'm not trying to love them. I'm not trying to have grace toward them. And so like when I now sense that, I am forcing myself to pray for that person. Excuse me. And I'll tell you, that's hard to do. Sure. So like I do oftentimes a morning prayer walk. And in that, I'll be like, God, search my heart. And there are times in that when I think about a person, I might go, and I start to go to an imaginary argument, and I'm stopping myself going, no, I'm going to pray for them. And it just helps my heart because I need God's help. I need God's help to soften because oftentimes it is hurt. The anger is rooted in like, okay, my feelings have been hurt, or I feel like I've been misunderstood, or or I haven't had a met expectation, like in marriage, that's one of those things, right? Where like you have in your mind what you want, what you desire, your spouse doesn't meet it, and you can go right to the negative. They're just choosing to be that way. And then all of a sudden, and so like, that's what I'm asking God to help me in. And I think that's a critical part to it is asking God to help us to know our hearts better. And then just to be real with ourselves. If I'm having an imaginary argument, stop it. If I'm wanting to gossip, stop it. I need to go directly to that person.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, and I know we've had conversations about this before, but like as Christians, we should assume the best in the sense of having a posture of charity and grace. Because I do think our natural bent is to assume the worst, as you just implied, right? It's true in marriage. It's true in every relationship where you feel like you've been snubbed, you've been hurt. We just assume the most malicious of intent, the most malicious intent behind that, rather than assuming, hey, maybe it was a misunderstanding. Like maybe they just were tired, maybe they're just frustrated, maybe they had a bad day, and that be the posture and mindset that we carry into it, rather than, as you said, really having imaginary, like the assumption is based on the imaginary, like things that you don't know. We fill in the gaps so many times with the negative, and that only reinforces the pain and hurt that we're already experiencing and leads further down that path, which is where gossip and slander often come from.
And I would add to that too, of not only like they might have a different perspective and stuff. I could actually be wrong. Yeah. And that's something that, again, I say to our staff, I've said before, we actually have another podcast by that name. I could be wrong, but it came from that posture of realizing not only this person might not have done what I thought they've done. Sure. They might have a different perspective, but I could be the one wrong in it. And that's that humble posture. If I go to confront someone, I can't go with two guns blazing. Yeah. Where I'm like, I'm right, you're wrong. Sit down and listen to all the ways you're wrong. And then, that person doesn't respond. Okay, see, they're just as evil. Like you have to go with the perspective to say, hey, I want to share my perspective. This, what you did hurt me. What you did, it felt this way. I could be wrong. Can you just help me understand? In my experiences, more often than not, people will respond well to that. Yeah. You do have people that have narcissistic tendencies that won't. You have people that will get defensive. And so you got to prepare yourself for that. But even then, once that happens, all the commands about loving your enemies, those then come into operation. Gossip is never going to be permitted in that, because it's just so destructive in relationship. All right, can I ask you a question, both of you guys a question concerning this? All right, so one of the things that we even have as pastors, we have to talk about issues, right? We have to talk about different things that are going on so that we can give good pastoral counsel, good pastoral care. There are times even in the spiritual authority that we have to confront people. And so I remember when you first came on staff, there were times I had to give you some background on some situations you were stepping into. So on one surface, it could look like, is that gossip?
Yeah.
And it wasn't, because it was you need to understand the full picture so you can step into this in the spiritual authority. Well, if someone is watching and they're going, okay, this situation that I'm in is complex. I genuinely want reconciliation. I might even be willing to talk to them, but I don't know how to do it. What suggestions would you give them about seeking godly counsel? What does that look like? Are there any like parameters you would put on that? Because I would simply say you can't just go to anyone,
right? Because
there's you got to be careful who you talk to. So what are some thoughts you would give them just to help shape that?
I was going to say it starts with knowing the other person's heart that you're going to go and have a conversation with. That you're going to be seeking
that's
counsel.
That's not involved. Exactly,
that you're seeking counsel from. If they are prone to biting into gossip, if they're prone to just always reaffirming what you say, what you think, what you feel, they might not be the best person to go and get that counsel from. If they're people who ask good questions and they ask questions that both challenge the way that you think about the situation, and they challenge you always to do the right thing, like that's a safe person that you can go to and say, I'm in this complex situation. Can you help me navigate this so that I can achieve reconciliation? And so like I'd say you have to know who it is you're seeking help from, because if they're just constantly reaffirming, like it just becomes a gossip session at that point.
Right.
Yeah, I just would reiterate that same exact thing. I mean, go to the person that you know that's going to point you in the way of Jesus, right? They're not just going to affirm you.
Even if it drives you crazy.
Yeah, even if it drives you. And again, that's where, again, you have to know your own motive. You have you have to be able to start with searching your own heart and say, do I really, as you said, do I really care about reconciliation? Do I really care about doing things the Jesus way in this moment? If I do, the person I seek out needs to be a person who's going to challenge me where it's necessary and point me in the direction of Jesus. I would say the other thing is don't talk to more people than you need to, and don't say more than you need to. Like, you know what I mean? In the sense of, I don't think you need to bring 15 people in to get counsel on this. It might be one or two trusted individuals that have a certain reputation. So in our context of the church, it could be a pastor, it could be a connect group leader, someone in your connect group that you just know has a spiritual maturity to them. But you go to them. Maybe you start with one person, you talk to them, and if they give you enough insight, wisdom, direction, maybe you don't need to talk to anybody else.
Right.
And don't say more than you need to say. I found in a lot of conversations, oftentimes we get in the weeds of details that are totally unnecessary to talk about. And that's where you very quickly do start to tread into the territory of gossip. Now, there are times and situations where someone that you're meeting with might ask you some clarifying questions to get a better picture. But I think even that, taking the humble posture of like, I'm not trying to out this person. That's not the intent of this meeting. Right. I'm asking for clarity, for wisdom, for insight and direction. Therefore, I'm going to start with saying this. Here's what I'm trying to figure out what I need to do. If more needs to be revealed, then that's okay. But don't start with don't start in that place, because I think that's oftentimes where our motives may not be pure.
I think a lot of people, not a lot of people, I shouldn't say it that way. I think sometimes that's an unhealthy practice. Is people will keep going to more and more people until they find the person that says what they like. And I think that's why I would go back to your great advice of find the person that's going to challenge you.
Yep.
And even the person is going to challenge you. Like where you're like, I think there's a story in Scripture where I think it's Sennacherib. It's king of Judah and the king of Israel are going to go to battle. And the king of Judah is like, don't you have any real prophets? Because all these prophets are false prophesying. They're like,
yes, man,
you'll be victorious.
And affirming him.
And he goes, oh, there was this one prophet, but he never says anything good. And he goes, go and get him. And it's like Micaiah or something like that. And he comes, and initially, like, he's a smart aleck. They're like, he's like, should I go to war? He's like, go to war. And he goes, well, how many times did I tell you? Quit being sarcastic with me. Tell me the truth. He goes, yeah, you go to war, you're going to die. He goes, see, I told you. I told you. But that's the friend you need. I think about on our staff, Tiff. All of our staff will tell you the same thing. If you go to Tiff about anything, she'll go, let's pray. Right? It doesn't matter what, let's pray.
You're going to pray about it with Tiff.
And like that's the person you want. You don't want the person that everything you post on social media they like. Because you need the friend that messages you privately and goes, hey, that post you just made on social media, it's not good.
Yep.
Like I would take that down. That's the friend you want. And so again, don't be selective to find the person that says what you want to hear. Find the person that's going to uncomfortably push you toward Jesus.
I was going to say the other thing is if someone has an authority in the situation, that's typically a safe person. So like a pastor or if it's at work, go to your boss. Go up. Don't ever go across like that way.
So
That's good. Do you guys have anything else you want to add? I love this conversation. I think it'll be profoundly helpful for people.
I think the biggest thing is, and it even goes back to the thing that Matthew said when he mentioned the scripture that Jesus talks about, like reconciling with your brother. We have to remember that the core of our faith is our relationship with other people. That sounds like a blasphemous thing to say, but what I mean is like the commands of Jesus are to love each other. Like, and that is where the root of our ethic, that's the root of our way of being faithful to God. That's where it stems. And so gossip destroys that. And gossip creates a heart and a posture in us that, and slander as well, that inhibits us from doing and becoming more like Jesus. And so those are the things that I think we have to, that is why we are so adamant and militant about it, because it is serious. It diminishes our witness and it diminishes our becoming like Jesus.
It's good.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Jesus said, by this, they'll know you're my disciples if you love one another. It is our light. It is our example. And I would say relationships are worth it. Yeah. And relationships are hard. That's the part of it that everyone needs to understand. Every relationship is hard. If you have any relationship for any amount of time, eventually you'll hit tension. And in that, a lot of times people think, oh, now here it is. It's broken relationship. And I'm like, no, you just hit tension. Yeah. Every friendship has tension. Every co-working relationship has tension. Every marriage has tension. Every parent-child, brother, sister. You have tension. And so you have to create a rhythm of how you're going to resolve that. And the relationship is worth it. It is worth it to Jesus, but it's worth it to your own life and heart. Because here's what I've also learned. Every broken relationship in my life impacts every existing relationship in my life. I've had broken relationships, not my own choice. You know, I have I have a close relationship in my life growing up that's no longer not my choice, this other person's choice. And it impacts me in ways I can't imagine. I don't even fully know how it impacts me. And so like every time I have frustration or unforgiveness, it's going to stay with me. I mean, it's the reason why people who get divorced, if they remarry, there's a higher chance they'll get divorced a second marriage and a higher the third. Why? Because that pain of the first marriage goes with them to the second, and the pain of those marriages goes with them to the third. It's the same thing in every broken relationship. So just know that gossip is a step away from reconciliation. Prayer to God is a step toward. Having a conversation is a step toward. Getting godly counsel is a step toward reconciliation, and it's worth it. But you have to learn that behavior and train yourself in that behavior. That's what James is saying in James 1 and 3. You have to train yourself in it. It doesn't naturally happen. The last thing I would say is don't take people's gossip to heart. I share this with our staff. Recently, I'll just share it quickly here. Years ago, I had a person tell me something negative about this person. And they had worked with them in a work relationship, and they told me something negative about them. And this was a person on staff that did it. They're not on staff anymore, but they told me, like, so they were like, oh yeah, this volunteer in the church, and they listed all the bad things working with them and all that. And so I was just like, okay, like noted. Like in my mind, I thought, no, like I'll be careful. That's kind of a red flag. A year goes by. This volunteer is amazing. 2 years goes by. Amazing. 3 years, amazing. Like never an issue, ever. Like ultra volunteer. And I remember thinking like, in back of my mind, I still had this check with them because of what, and then all of a sudden one day I realized that employee who's no longer on staff, I feel like they did that in multiple other situations where they just lied to me about someone. And I realized I'm judging this person not based on any of my own experience. I'm judging them based on gossip someone told me in the past, or slander at that point. And so like I just made a commitment in my mind. I'm going to judge every person based on my own interaction with them. And it makes all the difference. And so like if someone can gossip and you can go, oh, really? That's how they are? I would encourage you to take a step back and go, but what's your experience been?
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for the conversation and discussion. And as always, we want to thank you for tuning in. We hope it blesses you, encourages you, propels you in your faith and your walk with Jesus. That's what we desire to be, a tool in your discipleship journey. And as we always say, if it's been helpful to you and a blessing to you, share it with someone else as it might do the same to them. We love you. We thank you for tuning in, and we hope you'll tune in again next week.